This is the Mules Writer Chronicles podcast, Episode 11, Grandma and the Big Gray Dog. Hello out there, friends, and welcome to another episode of the Mules Writer Chronicles podcast. I am Craig Marlett, the Mules Writer, and the stories you will hear on this podcast are from my own journey, as I have traversed the planet on my quest for the true meaning of life. Today's story took place in the early 1960s when I lived for a short time with my grandmother Knowles before leaving to join my family in Florida. Grandma Knowles was a loyal Brit who was only 4 feet 8 inches tall, tougher than nails, and had a sense of humor that enabled her to turn even the hardest times into days of fun and laughter. So hop up here on my mule, and let's get ready for the next story entitled Grandma and the Big Gray Dog. Growing up in my home with my particular family was always a unique experience and usually lots of fun. My father was French-Canadian and my mother was of British descent, which meant that we could all sing God Save the Queen, but for my father's sake, we sang it like Maurice Chevalier. Keeping peace in a family often requires a lot of such compromise. At the heart of it all on my mother's side of the family was Grandma Knowles. She was about 4 foot 8 inches tall and had beautiful silver white hair that always reminded me of the angel hair my dad would place methodically on the Christmas tree every year. It was very soft and resembled a puff of billowy clouds, like you might see when looking down from very high airplanes. For as long as I can remember, my grandmother worked at the Allied paper mill on a midnight shift from 11 to 7 in the morning. It was a huge mill close to the Kalamazoo River, which runs from Lake Morrow in Galesburg up through Saugatuck and into Lake Michigan. My brothers and I used to fish there for carp, which we were not allowed to eat because the water in the river was so polluted by the mill. And being scavengers anyway, carp wasn't your typical dinner fish, unless you were a hobo. Back then, the study of industrial pollution had not become popular yet, and as young boys we just thought the water around the mill resembled light green milk. Catching the occasional six-eyed fish just meant we were having a lucky day.
Geez, that's going to wake me up tonight screaming.
Grandma was famous with the neighborhood kids because she had a glass eye, which she kept in a little jar near the bed whenever she was sleeping. Since she worked the night shift and slept during the day, I could always make a little extra change by sneaking a friend or two in for a look at the eye floating in the little glass cup. It's amazing what a young boy will pay to see such things when curiosity takes over. And with the addition of a little Ripley-style intrigue on my part, it was a nice little side business. A look at the eye could cost anywhere from a nickel to a quarter, depending on my financial status at the time. And if you had another 10 cents, I would show you her teeth, which she kept in another jar by the bed.
Son, you give new meaning to the word entrepreneur.
Grandma never knew she was on display for the benefit of the local neighborhood economy, and me. But knowing her, it wouldn't have been a problem, since she always liked to do her part. In those days, the immigrant population in Michigan was still only 1 or 2 generations old. Unlike many of those coming to America today, they came with the idea of helping to build this great country, and giving back was as important to them as the getting was. Of course, they all wanted their fair portion of the American dream, but they were willing to work hard to get it and share what they earned with those around them. They were building a life and a nation, and after the war ended, everyone knew there was something special happening in America. My grandfather Knowles was a tailor and worked at a factory where they made expensive fur coats. Genuine fur coats were the rage back then, and nearly every woman had one hanging in her closet. In my neighborhood there were very few minks, but a beaver or even a muskrat would suffice to give a woman a certain social standing on the occasional special outing or night at the Moose Lodge.
I'm calling Peter.
My mother had a fur coat, but found out later she was allergic to some animal furs, so she rarely wore it except when the occasion was really special. Grandpa Knowles died on my 3rd birthday in a fire at the fur company where he worked. The owner of the factory was trapped in his office closet, and in the process of saving his boss's life, my grandfather was burned alive. Apparently, once his employer was freed from the blazing inferno, he ran out without trying to return the favor. In an unusual twist of fate, the owner died some years later in another fire in the same office.
What is this, the Twilight Zone?
Life has a funny way of leveling things, I think. For a while during the early 60s, I stayed with my grandmother in a little house on Long Lake. It was great living with her, as she was always a barrel of laughs. She told the funniest jokes, and to this day I know of no one who had a quicker wit than her. Everything in her life was a prop that could be used at the drop of a hat if she felt the need to cheer someone up or just get a little laughter going. Nothing was sacred except her pictures of Queen Elizabeth, Jesus, and Winston Churchill, which hung on the wall behind her loom in a place of honor.
We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe...
She had a beautiful four-harness loom made of solid maple, on which she would weave multicolored rugs from yarn and other materials. Not being a business venture as much as a hobby, these were usually given to family members, friends, or to some needy neighbor who might appreciate such a gift. To my knowledge, my grandmother never did anything with her own self in mind. Her entire life was about helping to make things better for others. Grandma was a loyal British subject, and living thousands of miles away from the country where she was born never kept her from the particular habits that make up daily English life. Every morning I would awake to the smell of fresh scones or English muffins being prepared with a pot of tea and soft-boiled eggs heated for exactly 2.5 minutes. She would set the table with the muffins, fresh butter, the pot of tea, and her favorite orange marmalade. Then came the 2 small glass decorative egg cups, which looked like miniature ice cream sundae dishes from the local soda shop. These would be placed on the covered table, one for her and one for me, and each one would hold an egg perfectly in place so that we could crack the tops of the shells with a little spoon and take the crown off without disturbing the precious golden yolk inside.
You could have just went to McDonald's.
It was a ritual of sorts, much like the Eucharist service she often attended on Sunday mornings at St. Luke's Episcopal Church in downtown Kalamazoo. Before I went to stay with my grandma on the lake, she lived alone with Buster. Buster was her mixed-breed dog that had short black hair and a leather chain around his neck with several bells attached. Until I came to stay with her, Buster was the only other house guest and sole beneficiary of the many scones, muffins, and breads my grandmother liked to serve for breakfast. Eventually, this made his body look like a small black suede suitcase with a head, 4 stubby legs, and no neck. He was very tightly packed in his skin, and when he ran, which didn't happen that often, he resembled a large cannon shell from one of the big war guns I had seen many times on display at Fort Custer. Buster was not a mean dog, unless you got too close to Grandma. Having lived together for 15 years or so, I suppose he felt it his bounden duty to protect this little British lady who treated him so well and gave him a steady diet of rich foods and true love.
Step back, buddy. Leave the lady alone.
When he finally did pass away, his heart was as big as the jovial fat lady on Hee Haw. Not so much with love, but rather from the years of bacon and soft breads given to him by his best buddy, Grandma Knowles. When Buster died, we were all worried that my little grandmother might be right behind him. Oddly enough, she took it well and soon after adopted another dog that she named Gunther. This was an unusual name for a dog, but some said it was a reminder of her first boyfriend back in England, who was supposedly born with a rare disease that made his hair turn gray by the time he was 18. Having lived in Hong Kong for several years and having met many British folks, I now believe that Gunther, the man, being a frugal Englishman and wanting to save money whenever possible, faked the illness, shaved his head, and took to wearing used gray wigs that he found in the alley behind the Parliament building, all in an effort to save money on haircuts.
That's a bit over the top, I'd say.
Be that as it may, Gunther, the dog, moved in shortly after Buster went to that great bakery in the sky. A purebred Weimaraner, Gunther stood about 2 feet tall, had a beautiful shiny coat of gray hair and long spindly legs. He was only about 6 months old when Grandma adopted him, and he loved to run and play all day. A strong dog, he would often knock my grandmother to the ground, thinking she wanted to play whenever she went outside and took him along. On other occasions, seeing a cat or something else that triggered his youthful enthusiasm, he would take off running, pulling Grandma along like a rag doll attached to a runaway freight train. It's amazing that she never got seriously injured, but somehow she managed to survive and still have great affection for her big gray playmate. I guess, being the kind of woman she was, she realized he was just doing what came naturally and tolerated it as part of the job of raising him. I loved to fish and was constantly trying to come up with new ways to get the long nightcrawler worms that came out in the evenings whenever the ground was wet would do. Spreading used coffee grounds on a small wet area of the yard was a good way to attract them, but the lake out back provided the opportunity for fishing every day, which required a plentiful supply, and being tea drinkers, we rarely had enough coffee to coax more than a few skinny ones to the surface. One of our neighbors, whose name I've forgotten now, helped me to rig a special device that could bring the nightcrawlers to the surface quickly where I could grab them and throw them into a dirt-filled coffee can. It was made from attaching 2 electric wires to an umbrella stock that had been stripped of all its ribs and fabric. I would then saturate the ground with a water hose and let it soak in for about 30 minutes. Next, I would plug the wires into the outside electric socket, and voila! Out came the worms like magic. It was a lot like watching Japanese office workers running from Godzilla on the Saturday morning matinee. There was only one trick to the process, making sure you didn't get too close to the electrified umbrella, since the ground around it would conduct enough electricity to give you a good jolt if you were anywhere within 2 feet. Other than that, it was a marvel of science, and I was grateful for having my own personal Mr. Wizard living nearby. Grandma also liked to fish now and then, and, of course, wherever she went, Gunther was never far behind. We couldn't leave him alone in the house while fishing, as he would sense that he was missing out on some fun and chew on a shoe or one of Grandma's yarn spindles until we let him join the party. He made it clear that if we tried to leave him behind, it would not be without cost. It was a catch-22 situation for us, to be sure. If we did take him with us, he would run up and down the dock, clicking his long toenails on the metal surface, while trying to get us to play with him instead. Casting was also challenging when Gunther tagged along, as he would try to grab the bait during the drawback and then jump into the air like one of the Walenda family upon release, attempting to catch the fast-moving worm, hooks, sinkers, and all. Since Grandma just dropped her line over the side of the dock, he always focused on me, turning my attempts at casting into a spastic ballet, resembling a one-legged tap dancer trying to avoid an attack of killer bees. If we did catch a fish, there was no way to get it safely off the hook before Gunther would stick his big pink and gray nose into the situation and try to take the flopping fish away. One day, after Grandma and I had already fished for about an hour or so, she decided to go in and prepare dinner while I continued to fish. Needing more bait, I went to the garage to get out the electric worm hunter. Since the ground was still somewhat damp, I stuck the umbrella in the moist soil, plugged it into the electric socket, and waited for the magic to begin. I didn't have to wait very long. As the worms started appearing, I got down on my knees and began the retrieval process. Gunther, who had stayed outside with me, could hardly restrain himself from the youthful curiosity of wondering what I was up to. Seeing all these strange-looking creatures rising to the surface, he ran forward to bark at them and, coming within just a few inches of the umbrella rig, got a rather sharp jolt of electricity right in the nose. This, of course, only made him confused, whereby he jumped backward and became entangled in the extension cord, yelping and howling as though he had just been strapped into an electric chair. As Grandma came outside to see what the ruckus was about, Gunther spotted her and ran toward her in a flash, dragging the still-plugged extension cord behind him. The combination of excitement and surprise being too much for him, he then snagged his foot on the bare hook of my fishing rod that was lying in the grass nearby. "Are we having fun yet?" This caused a chain reaction of events, and by the time everything was over, my little English grandmother was sitting on the ground with Gunther on her lap, having dragged a fishing pole, umbrella rig, and extension cord behind him, which now lay wadded on the ground like some surrealistic fishing net art one might see in a New York museum. In the end, we managed to remove the fishhook from Gunther's paw, get everything untangled, and return to some sense of normality before things got too far out of hand. Gunther, being obviously too big for my 90-pound grandmother to handle, was given to someone younger who could deliver the high-energy environment he needed without risking life and limb. Not long after that summer, I moved away from Grandma's house by the lake and went to stay with Uncle Bob and Aunt Janet Marlette. This allowed me to finish my 8th grade school year while my family moved south to Florida. Life with my grandma was filled with great experiences, from which I am still learning to this day, though that summer is way behind me and Grandma Knowles has gone on to her reward. For one, no matter how much you love someone, it doesn't mean you are able to be everything they want you to be or that you want to be for them. As much as Grandma wanted to have another lifelong friendship like she'd had with Buster, she was not able to provide what would have been required to experience the same from the big gray dog. A lifetime of hard work and kindness eventually wears you out, and no matter how hard you try, you can't avoid the reality of time. I also learned not to sweat the little things. Looking back at all the challenges that Gunther delivered on a daily basis, it was well worth it just to have known another living creature that had such zest for life and loved effortlessly with no strings attached. Most important, I think, was what I learned as I witnessed the courage of my little English grandmother. Though by that time she had already put in a hard 70 years of life, the things she believed in allowed her to wake up each day and find pleasure in the simple things and the gift of being with those she loved. A year later, my grandmother and I met another great dog, not quite as fast or friendly as Gunther, when we boarded a Greyhound bus together and headed for Florida to join my family. It was a 3-day trip that yielded many adventures and challenges perfect for a book such as this. But I'll have to leave that for another day. The teapot is whistling and the eggs are ready to be served. I have to get the butter from the fridge and the marmalade from the cupboard. But I promise I'll be back to tell you the rest of the story later. Well, thanks for listening to my story today. I hope it was as fun for you to hear this story about my wonderful little grandmother as it was for me to live it. If you like the show, be sure to tell all your friends and invite them to join us on the journey as well. I'll be back next week with another episode from my crazy life. So until then, this is the Mules Writer saying, so long.